Full maiden name of mother, Stanley Ann Dunham. Stanley? Does that mean she was a dude? Obama had two dads. Which one was his biological father? At this point, we can't be certain who this man's parents are, which means I have no proof that he's even a black man. He could be white. And if that's the case, I don't understand why we're questioning his legitimacy.
Last night, Stephen Colbert joked about birthers still not being satisfied with the long-form birth certificate released by the president yesterday. Satire these days is never too far from the truth. A Snap Robo poll done by Survey USA shows 18% of respondents still have doubts about where the president was born. Another 10% say the long-form version released yesterday is a forged document. At some level, I gotta say, these are heartening numbers because, frankly, I thought they'd be higher. Still, I won't be surprised if we see those numbers creep back up as the forces of denial regroup and launch their inevitable bevy of conspiracy theories about the document's authenticity. Now, at the end of the day, the birther issue is not the biggest deal in the world. People believe all kinds of crazy stuff. The real issue is the relationship our public life and political debates bear to reality, how facts link up to policy. That has become disturbingly unmoored over the last decade. The issue of the president's origins is one thing, the reality of global warming quite another. There seem to be the same dynamics at play in both. Former White House spokesperson Robert Gibbs said yesterday, "There are no more arbiters of truth. So whatever you can prove factually, somebody else can find something else to point to it with enough ferocity to get people to believe it. We've crossed some Rubicon into the unknown." Well said. Case in point, the same day President Obama released his long-form birth certificate, Oklahoma's State House approved a birther bill requiring presidential candidates to provide proof of citizenship to get on the ballot. Joining me now, Jonathan Kay, managing editor of Canada's National Post newspaper and author of Among the Truthers, A Journey Through America's Growing Conspiracist Underground, and Chris Mooney, science and political journalist and author of We Can't Handle the Truth in the current issue of Mother Jones. Both are excellent reads. I recommend them highly. Jonathan, let me start with you. For the new book, you spent 3 years immersed in the world of conspiracy theorists. And I'm wondering what you ended up concluding about what powers them, what draws people to them and keeps people attached to them.
Well, ultimately, conspiracy theories are a way to reconcile people's ideology with reality. It's a bridge between the world they want to be and the world that exists. So in the case of the birthers, there are a lot of people who just cannot get their head around the fact that Americans elected a somewhat left-wing president, and it doesn't jive with their view of the United States. It doesn't jive with their view of the way reality should be. So they've created a sort of mythology that allows them to believe it didn't really happen, that Obama is actually illegitimate, that all they have to do is unmask him as a sort of hoax president, and history will be set right. It allows them to, as I say, reconcile the world they want, which is a right-wing America with a right-wing president, with the world that actually exists with Obama in the White House.
I like this phrase, the bridge from ideology to reality. And Chris, in the article you wrote for Mother Jones, sort of about the science of belief formation. There's a lot of research that sort of backs up that premise, right?
There is a science of why we deny science, right? There are facts about why we can't accept facts. And basically, it's a theory called motivated reasoning. And what it does is it takes modern neuroscience and, shows how our processes of reasoning are actually driven by emotion. And we make up our minds subconsciously before we're even actually consciously thinking what we think, and then we're down a path, and we're already rationalizing.
Right, and so then the rational thought is actually this sort of retroactive construction. So here's the question I have for both of you. The big question, I think, is, and the profound one is, are conspiracy theories a difference in kind or a difference in degree from regular belief formation? I mean, because at the end of the day, people who are watching this are trusting that I'm not lying to them. And when I read a newspaper or when I read the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Report from the UN, I'm trusting that the whole thing isn't a fabricated hoax, right? So how different is, John, maybe you can answer this, is there something that delineates conspiracist belief formation from sort of normal belief formation with all of its biases, et cetera?
Yes, there is. And that is the fact that if you take a normal, rational person and you give them contrary evidence to what they believe, they will re-examine their original hypothesis. Whereas if you take a conspiracy theorist and give them contrary information, they will always simply expand the circle of conspirators. So, for instance, in the case of the birthers, if you say, well, you know, the Secretary of Health and the governor, they've all said the birth certificate is legitimate, they will simply draw a bigger circle around the conspiracy and say, well, they're in on it too, the media's in on it too, the justice system is in on it too. It's a pathological way of thinking, which is utterly different from rational thought. I actually compare it to religion in the sense that if you are a committed Christian or a committed Jew or a committed Muslim, it doesn't matter what your faith is. If someone gives you contrary evidence to your beliefs, you won't simply say, well, I guess I'll re-examine my religious beliefs. You'll say, I take this on faith, and that's the way I believe. Conspiracy theories in many ways is sort of a religious faith for a secular age.
Chris, but that sounds, everything that he just said reminds me somewhat uncannily of some of the social science results that you cite in your article, which is that you do give people confounding information and they simply reassert the original error.
I would say that it is just an extreme version of something to which we're all susceptible. You know, when people read my piece, they said, oh, this is kind of like arguing with my spouse. This is kind of like arguing with a member of my family who has different politics, and they'll never change their mind, they'll never change their mind. It's the same process, but it goes farther. And some of us learn checks on the process. Journalists are supposed to learn checks. Scientists are supposed to learn checks, but even these groups, as we know, fall all the time for biases.
So here's my question. So let's say there's some sort of background. John, you sort of go through a lot of psychological dispositions that might lead people towards conspiracist thinking. You talk about our just general biases and the way sort of our brains work. The question is Robert Gibbs right that the nature of American public life at this moment makes these problems worse, exacerbates them as opposed to mitigates them? John, what do you think about that?
A big problem is the technology, because this has always been part of human psychology. The problem is now technology, and in particular the media on the internet, allow people to inhabit their own reality on websites. The conspiracy theorists that I interviewed, they don't watch shows like this. They don't watch the mass media. Typically, they're in their own little self-contained internet bubble of people who think like they do. So in their mind, they're not outsiders because they're surrounded every day, virtually, by people who think the way they do. This has never existed in American society prior to the internet. Conspiracy theorists always had to go outside, interact with people, turn on the mass media, read a newspaper eventually, because that's the only way to get news. And so they were confronted with the fact that they were outsiders. That reality doesn't exist now. They can go into a custom-made reality inhabited only by people who share their esoteric beliefs. That is new.
Chris, is that your sense? Is it your sense that the internet, this is like knock number one on the internet, right? That the internet is sort of reinforcing this cocooning, this sort of knowledge cocoon?
It's a role, but I don't think it's the only factor. I think there's a reality gap between the parties. Republicans and Democrats believe different things about a lot of issues, and it turns out Republicans are more likely to be wrong. We can talk about that. But one of the factors is, you know, everyone has their own experts now. There's been a 30, 40-year campaign to build right-wing think tanks to fight back against academic experts. And so, you know, everyone can say, I've got a PhD who thinks this, and for every PhD, there's an equal and opposite PhD.
So finally, in the vaunted tradition of cable news, I want to give each of you like 30 seconds to say what we can do to combat it, because that strikes me in the case of global warming particularly, which is a very, very high-stakes conspiracy theory that a majority of Republicans out there share. John, what did you learn about how you sort of break this kind of vicious cycle that conspiracists are under?
Well, ultimately, you have to teach people that conspiracism, which is what I call this way of thinking, is akin to any other pathological way of thinking. We've taught ourselves to get around racism, for the most part, taught ourselves to get around homophobia and sexism in some cases. We have to teach people that conspiracism is a way of thinking that is pathological, and you have to exercise your mental self-discipline to try to get around it.
Chris, you get the last word on this?
Well, it seems like emotions are what drive us down the wrong path, so we need to de-emotionalize issues, and we often, if we want to change somebody's mind, we have to not hit them with facts. We have to hit them with a different way of thinking about it that is more consonant with what they feel is the way the world should work. And it's a different strategy.
Chris Mooney, science journalist, has a great piece in Mother Jones, The Science of Why We Don't Believe in Science. John Kay from the National Post, author of a great new book called Among the Truthers. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.